From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today during his weekly segment on the grain market trends, K-State's Dan O'Brien will comment on the grain production and price forecasts released by the USDA at its World Agricultural Outlook Forum yesterday. And Dan will remark on the market reaction to reportedly good progress in the U.S.-China trade talks. Also today, a visit with Kansas Secretary of Agriculture Mike Beam. He'll talk about his aspirations for the Kansas Department of Agriculture as he settles into his new post, and about the priority issues that Mike expects the department will address in the months ahead. And of course, this being a Friday, we'll hear from K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather, along with much more, here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and welcome aboard once again for another Agriculture Today. Well, the USDA served up new numbers on grain supply and demand in its yearly Agricultural Outlook Forum. The 2019 edition was put out there yesterday, and of course the markets are taking a look at those numbers and responding accordingly. For his thoughts on those numbers and on other grain market developments, grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. Before we dive into all of the USDA figures, the markets yesterday got a shot in the arm from a slight hint of resolving the China trade issue, Dan.
Yes, it seems that negotiators for the U.S. and China are actually sitting down and putting things on paper, developing some memorandums of understanding that would deal with some of the areas where the two countries are in conflict. So I think given the high stakes that U.S.-China negotiations involve, not just for agriculture, but for all manner of trade, that there's some tangible movement towards anything more than just sitting across the table and glaring at each other and saying what they're not going to do is a positive move. So the grain markets responded somewhat positively. And really, again, they looked at what came out of the USDA Outlook Conference on the first day. Again, there wasn't anything overtly, terribly negative there, but I think, just as you've indicated, Eric, the bigger issue that would have immediate impact, hopefully pretty soon impact, pretty much immediate impact, would be some type of positive resolution to U.S. and China trade. And, of course, that affects the soybean market. Mm-hmm. But given what we've heard discussed about China's desire to be aggressive buyers of all U.S. ag products, gosh, if there's an agreement that could be forged, I'm sure the grain sorghum people would be looking towards what could happen on increased grain sorghum exports to get that factor of their supply-demand balance sheet looking better. Even discussions of wheat and corn being involved in some of that positive action. So I guess we'll see. The response yesterday, corn futures closed up about 3 or 4 or 5 cents. Soybean futures up about 6 to 8.5. Wheat futures didn't fall, up about 5. So all to the good, really, and welcome news. But I think the proof will be in the actual agreement. As the number of market analysts, veteran market watchers have indicated, this is a negotiation over fundamental practices of nations when it comes to their economy and how they trade. So it'd be great to get a quick resolution and no residual impact. But we just have to be cognizant of how difficult the issues are that are on the table that both countries are having to deal with.
Right. And wandering into those USDA outlook numbers, let us begin with soybeans, in that the Chinese trade situation was addressed as Chief Economist Robert Johansson announced the numbers. And the bottom line to his thinking was that even if Chinese trade channels are cleared up for more movement of soybeans, the overabundance of soybeans will be around for the foreseeable future, keeping a lid on that market.
And that is what USDA long-term forecasters do. They make forecasts based on the best information they have, and sitting here in February of 2019, they're not anticipating any problems with planting the 2019 corn, soybean, or any other crop. They're not anticipating any problem during the production season that could come in and take a large bite out of the carryover ending stocks that we brought into these years for any of these crops. They're not anticipating any issues overseas. So I don't want to be critical of this, but the reality of these long-term forecasts that come out of the USDA are that they're assuming normality, and they're assuming non-volatile environments and no surprises, and they're not, and that's for either the high side or the low side of prices and potential supply-demand paths. So they are what they are. They're a viewpoint for this coming year and the next 5 to 10 with no real surprises. And with that, you're looking at prices where they're at about now. Another challenge, I think, with projecting low prices as they are right now is that the current low prices are causing some financial problems to the degree that we continue with prices that are covering variable costs but not all of fixed costs. Then you end up in a situation where operating debts mount for farmers, not just in any one area or any one slice of the farm economy, but for the whole bunch on the crop side. So low prices tend to cause shifting of acres. And that's what we have here, basically a projection of corn prices, $3.65 per bushel in the coming year, which, again, that under the best irrigation yields we have in Kansas, that is about full economic cost break even, but you have to have the 200-plus bushels to get to that. Anything less, even on some dry land situations. When we're shorter on bushels, it's harder to get to that $3.65 U.S. average price. For beans, $8.80. And the blessing of beans has been that at those prices, we've generally been able to cover variable costs pretty well. A lot of times when you look at around Kansas, variable cost is about $7 to $8, $7.50, something like that. But it's the fixed costs, and a lot of that's labor and machinery, and some land in there too. But surprising, the large amount of labor and machinery in that we see in all that. By the time you add that in, $8.80 doesn't look near as good as about $9.50 to $10 would be in covering those costs. So again, a so-so situation for wheat. Projection of about $5.20, up about 10 cents from where we were at, and we would welcome that. The challenge, I think, is that if you look at wheat futures, they've been hitting much lower. Again, you look at where we were in December for feed grains, for oilseeds, and wheat. The one crop that's faltered most in terms of at least the futures prices has been on the wheat side, and I think what's happened is that in the latter part of last year of 2018, it seemed like we had major problems coming in the Black Sea region, and that was on top of major problems in production in Australia. Well, it's turned out now that Russia has decided to keep going, even at the risk of tightening up their domestic supplies, but they've kept going on their exports. And Ukraine has stayed pretty strong in terms of their exports and available supplies. So if problems are going to come in those foreign areas, they've been pushed back a little bit more into coming months. And so a higher wheat price would be great. I hope in 2019 as we go forward that the USDA's numbers hold true and that we have another good quality crop. That will help us immensely. One other thing I want to mention, on their acreage numbers, the USDA came out in the fall and projected soybean acres at about 82.5 million acres. Yesterday came back and raised that number by about 2.5 million up to 85, but left corn unchanged at 92 from what they had before. And on wheat, came in and projected 47 million acres. And looking at that February 8th report, you could work with the numbers, and it would seem that you could justify an expectation of even lower U.S. acres than that. So if winter wheat acres are low, they must be anticipating that the spring wheat acres to the north and soft red winter wheat in the eastern Corn Belt are going to be strong enough in terms of their quantity that they offset what we're down. on the hard red winter wheat side. And really, that remains to be seen. We're talking a lot about these reports numbers yesterday, but there's a lot of weather uncertainty and a lot of wet soils and a whole bunch of cold temperatures that are happening right now towards the end of February, heading off into March. And we're not that far from time periods when we would have hoped we were in the fields and getting ready to put some of at least the spring planted crops in the ground. So I don't know that futures markets in their current state are giving much credence to that. We will just have to see, but I guess that's an issue probably for Kansas farmers that have old crop 2018 supplies and bins. And really, given that we don't hear any gangbusters news out of South America, we're probably going to wonder where we're at in terms of our own crops as we head off into March, April, and May.
And as you say, the USDA assuming normal production conditions as they post all of these numbers and the accompanying price projections here, as far as a producer trying to seek out that best pricing opportunity moving forward, it will likely come in the event of something that's out of the norm, but that would be about it as far as higher prices.
Well, if we end up and have great crops in 2019, we'll continue the current supply-demand situation where we have more than adequate supplies and demand doing well in most cases, but still more than adequate supplies, stocks generally high enough that we're not worried about any shortfalls come fall of 2019. So again, I don't want to just bang the drum for any price movement, but I think you can acknowledge right now we have some factors that are going to bring about some volatility and uncertainty in the market. And again, it's worth watching. If we have any old crop grain and are looking for new crop pricing opportunities, what's happening once we move out off into March, but particularly April and May.
See Dan's notes on the markets, which include many of the things that he cited here from the USDA's World Agricultural Outlook Forum crop projections at agmanager.info, agmanager.info. Many thanks as always, Dan. We'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That's from K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien, our regular guest each week right here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, just a little over a month ago, the Kansas Department of Agriculture welcomed in a new State Secretary of Agriculture, and it's our first opportunity to be Mike's side with him. We welcome Mike Beam to the broadcast, and Mike, of course, is well known in the agricultural realm here in Kansas. And so, Mike, new undertaking for you. Congratulations on this, first of all.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been quite a whirlwind. And it's exciting, and fortunately, I'll have the opportunity to work with people that I've worked with in my previous job at the Kansas Livestock Association. So I didn't have to say a lot of goodbyes. Just moved into this position, which is quite different than what I've had in the past.
You put in 38 years with the KLA, right?
I did. I started as a very young man and really green. I was blessed to have the opportunity to do that and to learn with some great folks there, both from the staff standpoint but from members across the state. And I told somebody the other day that you've been in the association quite a while when you start working with grandchildren of folks that you remember as some of the members that you met when you first started. So I've started to work through the third generation, and fortunately most of those are still living, even the first and second generation, but it does somewhat date me.
But it also lent you a keen familiarity with Kansas agriculture in the broader sense.
I think so. Obviously, I work more closely on the livestock side, but this is a state with a lot of diverse operations, and so a lot of the members are diversified, and I had that exposure. But one of the things that I think is going to be helpful and I'm going to rely on is, we worked very closely with other agricultural organizations, both general organizations, including Kansas Farm Bureau, but most, if not all, the grain commodity organizations. I had the chance to meet with and work with those staff and those volunteer leaders. So I'm going to rely heavily on those relationships to make sure that I have a perspective of all of agriculture.
You've been in the Secretary's chair for, again, a little over a month now. As you've observed the KDA, you were saying before the broadcast that the width and breadth of what it is responsible for even caught you by surprise.
Well, it is. And I would say if someone wants to learn more about this agency, I've been very impressed with the website because you can find lots and lots of information. But I'm still getting briefings from various divisions, and today was the first time I had the chance to sit down with the individuals that manage, dairy inspection and feed inspection. They were throwing a lot of terms at me, and so it was very interesting. So you've got, like you said, the agribusiness services is what they call it, but it's, it touches animal health, plant work, plant safety, pesticide use, milk, weights and measures, and food safety. The agency was assigned several years ago the responsibility for monitoring and inspecting food establishments, and there's a large number of those across the state. So it touches all types of agriculture and agribusiness interests, and so getting a feel for that has been a challenge, but it's been fun, and I'm not the fastest learner, so sometimes it has to be repeated and we go through it again. But I'm still trying to get a grasp for that. But overall, I've been very impressed with the competency and the dedication that the staff and employees have at the agency.
Mike, have you had enough time to establish or even think about priorities for the department as you move forward?
Well, not a lot. I know we've got one priority is the lab that the agency has is in Topeka, and it's in a place that it's time to move, not just because the lease is running out, but we do need a new lab, and there is efforts and a plan in place to move that to Manhattan, close to the headquarters building. So that's going to be quite a challenge to work through that process. I want to make sure that those responsibilities the agency has, that the laws say that we do, is that we're doing the best we can with resources to be responsive and do an adequate job to make it a friendly place to do business, but yet protect consumers. So I want to make sure that we're doing the best we can in that area. And Secretary McClaskey has put together a really good team and a lot of emphasis on growth in agriculture and working with various communities. So the ag marketing sector, I think, is a very important part of the agency, and that's probably one I've spent the least amount of time with so far, but I've been impressed with a lot of the projects that are underway. The one thing I would like to make sure is, as we get into that next Ag Growth Summit in August, is that we are hearing from people who really have thoughts and ideas. And so, that's kind of a long answer, but I want to make sure that we're listening and making sure that we're available to people that have a stake in this.
Agriculture, of course, is ripe with issues and challenges. We think of water, animal health security, and other. All of these have been centerpieces of activity for the KDA. You certainly anticipate continued activity in those and likely others.
I do. On the animal health side, we're in the midst of this pilot project on traceability, and I've been real impressed with how far it's gone in less than a year. What's more impressive is we're having other states that are kind of signing on the fringes here of trying to cooperate with the traceability project. So I'm hoping to see some of the state secretaries of ag next week and visit with them because I know there's interest in Missouri. We've signed an agreement to collaborate with them. Oklahoma has expressed some interest in other states. So, that's intended to be a 2-year pilot project, and if the legislature includes the funding this year for 2020, by that time point, in working with USDA, I think will be the next step, and we'll have to see what that brings. And you mentioned water. There's a couple major policy issues on the front burner. In fact, there's the issue that Hayes and Russell has with their proposal to transfer water from water rights that they've purchased. It's a very involved process, and so they're getting anxious, and I can understand that. But the chief engineer is in the final phases of looking at all the comments and the engineering reports to issue his final determination on how much water they can transfer. And so that's on the front burner. And there's also the issue with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, who has been determined their water rights impaired. So the chief engineer is working with locals to try to resolve that. But water's huge, and this agency has been dealing with it, and I'm sure we'll be dealing with it even more so in the next few years.
Even as far-flung as water issues are, though, the state of Kansas, and no small credit to the KDA, among other agencies, is really on the forefront compared to other states in addressing these, frankly.
I would say so. Kansas stepped in, I can't remember the year, but it stepped in with the prior appropriation law and have put in some voluntary conservation measures in law to give people more tools. And I think we're ahead of some of the other states in the High Plains Aquifer region. And that's kind of where I think the culture of Kansas agriculture is based very much on multi-generation conservation. So there's a large interest. The challenge is the current economic situation and trying to make sure to correlate that with long-term conservation. And that's my view and experience, is that Kansas agriculture producers, to a large extent, share that value more than anybody I know.
So much more we could touch upon, Mike, but as a last item in our time here, your perception on the state of agriculture. We know that there are some tight economic times out there for any number of producers, so that does cast a bit of a shadow over the state of things. But how do you perceive it right now?
Well, I'd say we're in a very fragile situation. That kind of reminds me when I first started in the early 80s. We were in very much of an economic crunch. But the one thing I would say is if you look near term, our moisture profile looks strong. I think the USDA report recently said that they have expected net income across the United States to be up slightly in 2019. But, I just don't know how that relates to this part of the world and the types of agriculture we have. But I think it hinges largely on trade. That's our potential, not just in Kansas, but in agriculture. And if, the administration and our folks that are working on trade, international trade, if we can make some gains here in the next year, that will be a huge positive impact.
A pleasure to visit with you as always, and we're looking forward to the next time we get together, Mike.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Kansas Secretary of Agriculture Mike Beam, our guest on This Part of Agriculture Today. Now this break, after which we'll return with more here on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. For you now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue talked about trade and the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement with his Canadian and Mexican counterparts at the USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum yesterday. A lingering problem remains, though, over how and when the Trump administration would remove steel and aluminum tariffs against the country's closest trade partners. Those tariffs remain a thorn in getting the new USMCA trade deal ratified by Mexico and Canada. Perdue said he realizes that U.S. farmers are getting hit with higher machinery costs because of steel and aluminum costs, while commodity prices have declined or flattened. He said ideally the tariffs will be lifted sooner rather than later, in his words, but he had no specific knowledge of what's next. Canadian Agriculture Minister Lawrence Macaulay simply pointed to the steel and aluminum tariffs as a problem for the three countries that will need to be addressed. Canadian officials have said in the past they will not ratify the new trade deal unless those tariffs are lifted. And Perdue indicated he was optimistic that Congress could vote on the USMCA sometime early in the summer. Regarding the talks with China, Perdue said it was too early to get into specifics about increased agricultural exports, that despite Bloomberg reporting that China would agree in a memorandum of understanding to boost agricultural imports by as much as $30 billion. Perdue said all of this hinges on a bigger deal that requires structural reforms. The secretary added there are also continuing to be challenges negotiating with China on acceptance of biotechnology traits for crops. Still, Perdue added he's cautiously hopeful that both President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping want to come together and get that deal done. Now, the nation's chief agricultural trade negotiator says that the trade talks between the U.S. and China on agricultural issues are not just about continuing successful export business for commodities such as soybeans. The USDA's Rod Bain has more.
As U.S.-Chinese trade negotiations continue in Washington, D.C. this week, and reports of both sides working on structural agreements for what could be a potential deal, the chief ag negotiator of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office told an audience at the USDA Ag Outlook Forum Thursday that what is at stake for farm trade is, yes, about obvious trade highlights.
We have in that relationship historically some $12.7 billion worth of soybeans.
And, according to Ambassador Greg Dowd, why the U.S. is in part pursuing an improved trade agreement with the Chinese.
We haven't been able to sell China very much wheat or corn or rice because of the way they administer their tariff rate quotas.
Quotas that were the subject of a U.S.-filed World Trade Organization case against China. And according to the ambassador,
I believe at some point later this year we'll see some findings on that.
The U.S. has also filed a case before the WTO against China regarding their domestic supports for some agricultural commodities. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
As the USDA conducted its annual Agricultural Outlook Forum this week, a mix of reports show steady land values holding up against lower farm income and the poor long-term outlook. More on that from Agriculture Today's Britton Rucker. Britton?
Eric, some recent reports out of the regional Federal Reserve districts show the farm economy is stressed, but land values overall remain steady. The Kansas City Fed reported last week that land values have dipped slightly, about 3%, for irrigated and non-irrigated cropland in the district, while values for pasture land have gone up slightly. Demand for farmland remains high for the district, which includes Kansas, Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. Farmland sales overall are down in the district, but they did increase in Kansas and Nebraska during the fourth quarter of 2018 compared to a year earlier. Farm income in the 10th district declined for the 6th year straight as well, and bankers in that district expect farm income to remain weak in the first quarter of 2019. Bankers also reported overall lower capital spending compared to a year earlier, and about 30% of bankers said their farmer customers were cutting back household spending as well. The Kansas City Fed survey also reported that constant volume of farm loans is affecting liquidity a little more. The survey reported 15% of banks cited lower availability of loan funds compared to a 9% a year earlier. For Agriculture Today, I'm Britton Rucker.
Thanks, Britton. Now, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
With discussions on trade dominating the public discourse, it is vital for Kansas wheat farmers to preserve a trading partnership with our neighbor to the south. Mexico is the largest buyer of U.S. wheat in the world on average, going back many years. Mexico buys about 106.5 million bushels of wheat from the U.S. each year, including 55 million bushels of hard red winter wheat. Flour millers in Mexico generate strong demand for U.S. hard red winter wheat, the primary class of wheat grown in Kansas. In marketing year 2015-16, Mexico surpassed Nigeria and Brazil to become the top market for hard red winter. A rising number of industrial bakeries, along with traditional artisan bakeries, account for about 70% of wheat consumption, according to the association representing Mexican millers. That puts Kansas farmers and other hard red winter producers in a good position to meet that demand. Being closer to hard red winter production and having a highly functioning ability to import a large share of wheat directly via rail from the Plains states is an advantage for Mexico's buyers. Prior to implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, state intervention and import tariffs kept U.S. wheat exports out of the Mexican market. Now, most U.S. wheat farmers, especially Kansas farmers, rely on Mexico as their number one market. Yet our customers there have many other sources of milling wheat to which they can turn. In response to rising world grain prices in 2008, Mexico lifted a 67% import tariff on wheat from outside the U.S. and Canada. To date, the tariff has not been reapplied, and the Mexican import market is currently tariff-free for wheat from all qualified origins. If Congress doesn't pass the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, and the President pulls out of NAFTA, exports of wheat to Mexico may not be highly affected in the short term, but withdrawal would cause uncertainty in the currently stable wheat trade situation. Mexico could begin to shift their imports to other origins. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Next up on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather. And across the way, K-State climatologist Mary Knapp to share the very latest. And Mary, folks are weary of this winter, but we've more to come, it sounds.
Right. And the eastern portions of the state are a little bit more tired of this endless winter than the western parts, which have missed out on some of our systems. But the latest storm event, the Winter Storm Watch, covers basically the entire western two-thirds of the state. There's a small pocket of eastern Kansas, which doesn't fall under that. But again, it's a very broad expanse, and this storm system has its roots out in the desert southwest. Arizona and New Mexico are under winter storm warnings at the current time. So as we wait for this system to kick out into the plains, it behooves us to watch the latest updates as to what is happening with it. This is going to be a very tricky one because there's a sharp gradient between where the rain will be, the freezing rain, and the snow, and a very slight difference in the track of that low pressure system will make a huge difference in whether we see mainly rain, whether we have an extended icing period, or whether we get it all in the form of snow. So again, watch for the latest updates and be careful and look ahead on your plans for the weekend.
This comes on the heels of another week of snow, in fact, a couple of events, and cold temperatures one more time.
Right. Let's talk about cold first. When we look at departures from normal, the southwest and the southeast tied for being the closest to their normal temperatures at 5.8 degrees cooler than normal. And again, those were the warm spots for the week. The southwest averaged 30 degrees, and the southeast averaged 31 degrees. Mm-hmm. The coldest spot was the north central. They averaged 22.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which was 10 degrees cooler than normal.
That's quite a departure.
Yes, and that's the weekly average, not a single day's event. And again, we saw moisture. The west central came closest to average. They averaged 0.11 of an inch, which is 76% of normal. The southwest averaged only 0.03 of an inch, which is 18% of normal. The southeast didn't fare particularly well either. The amounts were a little bit higher. They averaged 0.29 of an inch, but that's only 66% of normal. They typically see more, as we all know. The southeast is a wetter portion of the state. The rest of the divisions were all above normal. The east central division had the most. They averaged 0.61 of an inch, which was 167% of their normal.
So this rather vigorous system moving in this weekend, in as far as moisture quantity, what's the expectation there?
Well, one thing we look at is the quantitative precip forecast, and this doesn't divide it into rain or snow. It looks at the liquid equivalent that is expected with the storm. And in the west, we're looking at half an inch or more. There is a swath from southwest Kansas up to northeastern Kansas where there may be as much as an inch to an inch and a quarter, and as you get into extreme northeastern, maybe as much as an inch and a half. You move out north and west or south and east from that swath, and the amounts drop off. But most of the state is expected to see at least a half an inch. The exception is the southeast, which may only see in the neighborhood of a quarter to a half an inch. That weekend event looks like it's going to be the bulk of the moisture for the next week. So after we get through with this weekend's event, we may see some sunshine. Temperatures aren't going to be particularly warm, but we are likely to get above freezing again, which it's been a while since our daytime highs have actually made it above that freezing mark. That will allow that snow to melt more rapidly than might otherwise.
But you say in that 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day series of outlooks, it's same stuff, different weeks, basically.
Right, and what's really noteworthy on that is the chances for cooler than normal temperatures are extremely high. We're looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, and for that period, which is the first week of March, there's better than an 80% chance that the Central Plains up to the Canadian border will have cooler than normal temperatures. Not quite so strong a signal on the moisture, but it's still tilted towards wetter than normal. So again, it looks like we're going to enter March with a cold, wet pattern. Question will be, how long does that persist?
And that leads us right into what has also been posted this week, the outlook for the month of March officially. And cooler temperatures, you say, are going to linger.
Right. With that strong tilt toward colder temperatures to begin the month, it's not surprising that the outlook for the month of March is for cooler than normal. Not quite as strong a signal as we had for that first week, but it is still very persistent. It, again, goes from the Canadian border and pushes all the way into northern Texas, goes west to the Front Range and east to the Great Lakes. So a very wide swath of the center of the country is in that cooler than normal. On the moisture side, it's not tilted quite as strongly. Again, wetter than normal, but that is confined to the eastern third of the country. The Central Plains is equally likely to be above or below normal. Again, we remind everybody that as we move into March, the amount that we expect on any given day, or for that matter, any given week, is constantly increasing, so it takes more moisture to make that wetter than normal or even equal chances. Yep. What we're looking at in the eastern two-thirds of the state are very saturated soils, wet ground, which brings concerns about spring planting. A dry pattern to start March would not be unwelcome, given some chance to get a little field work in. That outlook is not quite so positive as you go into the western third of the state. They wouldn't necessarily want to have an extended dry period for March, which is the beginning of their wet season. They'd really like to see some moisture there to keep that soil profile filled.
Meantime, stay on top of what's happening with the system moving in this weekend and the potential for some unfavorable conditions for travel and otherwise. Mary, thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp joins us each Friday right here, K-State Research and Extension climatologist, and we invite you to rejoin us right here on Monday, this same time, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.